Good morning to our US viewers and good afternoon to our European viewers, and welcome to this second Strategic Talks. My name is Mats Engman, and I'm the head of the Korea Center here at ISDP. The Strategic Talks series is an effort from our side to further promote dialogue and exchange of views related to the development on the Korean Peninsula and in the region. The overall aim of this new initiative is to increase the understanding of the many factors and policies that impact security developments, and we intend to do this by inviting prominent scholars and experts from different backgrounds and different nations to a friendly conversations during approximately 1 hour. We will strive to have a series of conversations within a rather short time span, covering the same issues but from different perspectives. This would, we hope, enable us to identify possible differences in understanding, assessments, and policies. These strategic talks will be public and recorded, but normally not including a Q&A part. But please feel free to make comments about the talk using the chat or commentary functions on the screen. In this first series of strategic talk, we have a clear security focus, and we will conduct 3 sessions during the month of June. We have done one already, and today's event is the second one. And the third talk will take place tomorrow at 900 hours AM Swedish time with 2 South Korean experts. But over to today's talk. I'm very excited for this second talk to have 2 true US experts joining me, Mr. Heino Klink and Mr. Frank Owen. Both of you are more than welcome, and of course, as are all our online viewers today. A short introduction of our 2 speakers before we start. Mr. Heino Klink is currently working through his independent consulting company, Klink Global, and has a very diverse background. Just a few, from 2019 to early 2021, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. In this role, he oversaw all US defense policy throughout the region and advancing US national security interests through defense strategy development and program oversight. Mr. Klink also has a military career and background, and among his many assignments, he was the military attaché in Beijing and Hong Kong for several years, and has been assigned to the US Army Pacific headquarters in Hawaii. Mr. Klink has made combat tours in both Kuwait and Iraq. As a business executive, he worked with the Northrop Grumman Corporation, responsible for international strategy and business development activities, focusing on promoting solutions to air and missile defense. He has an extensive academic background, including a Master in International Relations from Boston University, a Master from the University of London, and a Master in Global Strategy and Security from the University of Rome. Mr. Frank Owen is the Senior Expert on Northeast Asia at the US Institute of Peace. In this capacity, he oversees the Institute's work on Northeast Asia and focuses on ways to strengthen diplomacy and to reduce tension and enhance peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. From 2010 to 2017, he worked at the Department of Defense, including as a special counselor to the Army General Council, special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia and Pacific Security Affairs, and senior advisor on North Korea in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He has also served as head of delegation for working level negotiations with the Republic of Korea on US-ROK alliance matters. Frank Owen previously worked as a corporate attorney and has extensive experience in public and non-profit sector. He has a master from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and a Juris Doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley. All in all, I think you can conclude that we have 2 very experienced and well-qualified guests for the discussion here today. I've asked Heino and Frank to give a very short introduction to get a conversation going. So please, over to you, Heino.
Well, thank you very much, Mats, for that very kind introduction and for holding this very important discussion. And I'm very grateful to be able to offer some of my perspectives. I think we can all agree that, as the old adage goes, we live in very, very interesting times. All you have to do is, turn on your computer this morning, or for those of us that are still old school, go on your front porch and get, the Washington Post from your front stoop and look at the headlines, and you see that whereas all of us hope for greater stability and security and candidly peace in the world, unfortunately, the reality of the global situation, the global context in which we live is much, much different. Certainly underscored by the fact that, as the headlines demonstrate today, strongmen in the world, pariahs in the international community, they are all linking arms again to form, whether it's a new axis of evil, an arc of authoritarianism, whatever characterization you want to use. But the bottom line is cooperating, collaborating, in the face of the democratic West. So we have Putin meeting Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, and I'm sure we'll get into the details of his visit throughout our conversation. But most worryingly, based on the initial press accounts, signing a new agreement that has a mutual defense clause in it that, of course, is quite concerning for the United States, South Korea, and others. And of course, we all are aware, despite the denials, of North Korea's substantive contribution to the war effort against Ukraine, and how it really has had an operational impact on the front lines. And I would imagine, based on this visit, that support is only going to increase. And I would also offer, and maybe this did not make the headlines today because of Putin overshadowing everything else, but yesterday, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg was in Washington, and during a press conference with him and Secretary Blinken, although much of the focus was on Ukraine, I was struck by the fact that Stoltenberg said very explicitly, security is not regional, it is global. And we can't divide the world into theaters anymore. Everything is intertwined. I think, again, Putin's time in Pyongyang underscores that. And I think it also underscores the fact that our adversaries in the world agree with Stoltenberg, because I do not think it's a coincidence that Putin is visiting North Korea. I also don't think it's a coincidence that he sent a small flotilla to Cuba last week. And my big concern here is that we've seen over the last 3+ years a failure of deterrence globally. I would, go back to America's precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Then, of course, Russia's illegal aggression, invasion of Ukraine the following year, and then also what we see in the Middle East as being intertwined. And we see, again, deterrence that we have taken for granted, perhaps for too many generations, is failing. And for me, I think that is the greatest danger that we all face, whether we're living in the United States, Europe, or in East Asia. And that's something that has to be reversed. So let me just, with those very uplifting and optimistic comments, let me pause.
Thank you very much, Heine. Please, over to you, Frank.
Well, again, I'd like to reiterate the thanks to Mats and ISDP for giving me a chance to come on this talk and engage with Heine and ISDP. So I want to start by describing what I see as 3 profound shifts in North Korea's approach to foreign policy over the last few years that may be fundamentally changing the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. And the first shift is North Korea's approach to the United States. 50 years ago, the chairman of the North Korean Supreme People's Assembly, Hwang Jang-yeop, wrote a letter to the US Congress, this is May 1974, asking for talks to reach a peace agreement. And then for the next 5 decades, it was typically North Korea that has sought talks with the US, and the US had the leverage to say yes or no or apply preconditions. Today, the tables have turned. It's now the US that is seeking unconditional talks with North Korea, but North Korea no longer believes that peace is possible with the US. It's also refusing to engage in any talks with the US as long as denuclearization is on the agenda. The second shift is North Korea's approach to inter-Korean relations. Again, a little over 50 years ago, the two Koreas signed a joint communique in support of peaceful unification, at least in principle. Of course, North Korea has violated that principle many times over the next 50 years, but at least the joint agreement provided structurally the foundation for conciliatory efforts between the two Koreas. Today, that foundation no longer exists. North Korea earlier this year abandoned the policy of peaceful unification and now views South Korea as the principal enemy and as basically just another separate country rather than as related kin or family. And South Korea, despite its constitution, in many ways also sees North Korea similarly, especially the younger generation. And then the third shift is North Korea's focusing on solidifying ties with countries that it finds favorable, like Russia and China. Heino talked about the summit that Vladimir Putin had with Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang yesterday. This was his first visit to North Korea in 24 years. And in the summit, the two leaders upgraded their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership, and they vowed to beat international sanctions together. And on top of that, the support that Russia is providing to North Korea, including on things like satellite technology, nutritional energy assistance, the veto power at the UN Security Council, and the dismantling of the UN panel of experts, these things mean that there is little urgency for North Korea to change its behavior. And maybe North Korea even has the confidence and the latitude now to act in more irresponsible ways. And how is the US-South Korea alliance responding to this new strategic environment? As far as I can tell, so far, not in any new way. The alliance is continuing to use primarily a pressure-based approach to try and coerce North Korea back to the negotiating table to discuss denuclearization. This is the same pressure-based approach that the alliance has been using since the failure of the Elite Day deal in 2012. The only exception being in 2018, 2019, when President Trump and President Moon engaged directly with Kim Jong-un. And I think this pressure-based approach may have been reasonable 12 years ago, given our frustration with the collapse of the Elite Day deal and the fact that we hadn't really tried a robust pressure-based approach up until that point. Today, I think we have more evidence about this type of approach. The past 12 years, in my opinion, demonstrate that when the US applies pressure against North Korea and doesn't engage, North Korea tends to behave worse. When the US was applying a global pressure campaign against North Korea between 2013 and 2018, and between 2022 and today, these periods coincided with the greatest testing and advances in North Korea's nuclear and missile program, including 4 nuclear tests and hundreds of ballistic missile tests. And then conversely, when we engage with North Korea and offer the promise of incentives, North Korea tends to behave better. There's a 2017 study by Lisa Collins, formerly at CSIS, but now at DoD, that demonstrated this exact point, showing a strong correlation between periods of US engagement with North Korea and lower levels of North Korean provocation. And I'll give a few examples. One is the 8-year period between 1994 and 2002, when both sides were engaging heavily across many diplomatic, military, and people-to-people domains. And during this 8-year period, North Korea conducted 0 nuclear tests, 1 missile test, and they didn't reprocess any plutonium. Likewise, in 2011 and 2018, when we were engaging with North Korea, 0 nuclear tests, 0 ballistic missile test. So I think, this is correlational data. It doesn't imply causation. The point I'm trying to make is that Washington and Seoul need to do a better job of understanding what factors really reduce North Korea's bad behavior, and then develop policy based on this empirical evidence. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank. And once more, thank you to Heino. You've raised a lot of questions and a lot of things that we could kind of get back to. I would like us at least to leave 10-15 minutes in the end of the conversation to discuss possible ways forward, to, let's say, link up with what you addressed, Frank, about realizing that maybe the situation has changed in such a major fashion that we need to revisit our policies and our way forward. I don't know exactly how, but maybe that's something we can talk about. But I would like to start in another aspect, and that is to see if we can talk a little bit more about the current engagement between Russia and North Korea, and the meeting that has just taking place between President Putin and Chairman Kim. Did this come as a surprise to you, is my first. What do you see as the major impact on, let's say, inter-Korean relations and South Korean security posture? And I'm also a little bit curious, because both of you have experience from European affairs, because one aspect that I've been considering is that North Korea is now a security concern, not just for East Asia, because it's a concern even for Sweden, because it provides weapons to Russia's campaign and war in Ukraine, and even to Hezbollah and Hamas in the Middle East. So that is to tie in what you said, Heino, about this intertwined world, that everything is getting closer. And do you see that this understanding is that Europe needs to be more engaged with inter-Korean and North Korean Peninsula related affairs? So did the meeting come as a surprise? What does it mean for Peninsula specific situation, and what about the consequences for Europe? Those three aspects, please. Maybe I refer you, Heino, first. Thank you.
Sure. So the meeting did not come as a surprise in that it had been telegraphed months ago. You may recall when Putin visited his other close East Asian partner, Xi Jinping, there was a lot of reporting on whether or not he would go to Pyongyang in conjunction with his trip to Beijing. I would imagine that the Chinese voiced their concern that they wanted the trip to be a standalone trip. They did not want Putin to visit both Beijing and Pyongyang in one journey, if you will. And I think that's in part, at least, what influenced the current timing of the summit in Pyongyang. So it was not a complete surprise publicly. And I would imagine within private government channels, I'm sure, our governments, our intelligence services were aware. What would be interesting to know is that although it was announced in advance of the signing of this agreement in Pyongyang that there was going to be some sort of new defense pact, it would be interesting to know, and obviously neither Frank nor I are on the inside anymore. Did we know about that in advance? Because I do think there's some very, very disconcerting and, like I said earlier, dangerous implications for that. With regard to the Korean Peninsula, obviously this is not good news for peace and stability on the peninsula in terms of the fact that it only sharpens Russian support to North Korea, and the fact that now and again, I have not read the text of this agreement. If it commits Russia to supporting the DPRK in case of some sort of, quote unquote, armed aggression against the DPRK, that certainly complicates planning from a, from a U.S. ROC alliance perspective. And I'm confident that the Japanese are equally concerned. So you have now another factor that makes, the defense of South Korea even more difficult, potentially. And then with the European connection, yes, as you said, Mats, I mean, again, I think, it's based on what the information that's publicly available. And Russia in London has published some, really interesting data on DPRK military support to Russia. I mean, it has had an impact in the sense of, particularly in terms of munitions, artillery shells, because since the North Koreans have started supplying munitions to Russia, we have seen a shift on the battlefield. And just the ratio, not to get too much in the weeds as an old Army geek here, but when you talk about, the number of shells that the Russians are lobbing onto the Ukrainians, what the Ukrainians can return, it's off. I mean, it's like a factor of 7, sometimes 10, sometimes even higher, where where the Russians have the advantage. And that can be linked, in terms of artillery munition, can be linked directly to what the North Koreans are providing. And as you said, Mats, and I mean, I think, it's undeniable, this obviously has security implications for Europe. So whereas Europe may not be interested in North Korea, North Korea is going to be now interested in you, if you will. So it's, it is significant. It's something that I think the United States, again, in conjunction with its European and Asian partners, need to come up with mitigating strategies. And I hope, I don't know if this is the case, but I hope that this is a topic that makes itself onto the agenda for the NATO summit that's going to be held here in Washington next month, commemorating 75 years of the alliance. Because again, as the General Secretary, or excuse me, the Secretary General yesterday said, very clearly, these things are in fact intertwined.
Frank, over to you.
Well, I agree entirely with Heino. I think the trajectory of the cooperation between Russia and North Korea was apparent. We saw the Russia's moves to offer, with China, proposals for partial sanctions relief at the U.S. Security Council, vetoing U.S. resolutions against North Korea at the Security Council, dismantling the UN panel of experts. And so this is not surprising. And we've been, obviously, with Kim Jong-un's visit to the Vostochny Cosmodrome, this is just the next step in the growing relation that we've seen for the last several years. I think what's concerning is now that, you have on the UN Security Council at least one P5 member, if not two, that is supporting North Korea, right? So this global pressure campaign that we were hoping for, that started in the second term of the Obama administration and has continued, this campaign is effectively dead, I think. And so now you're seeing a shift to more of a maybe unilateral, bilateral, minilateral effort based on coalitions to continue to enforce sanctions and monitor illicit activities against North Korea. But our hopes for a multilateral global campaign is not there anymore. It's been undermined severely. And you have P5 members who are supporting a rogue nation, and Russia itself is itself a rogue nation as well. So my concern is that because it was so foreseeable, and yet I can't understand what actions the US and its allies took to preclude, forestall this type of cooperation, right? We're seeing on the Chinese side efforts to engage with South Korea and Japan through the trilateral summit. The US has not taken similar steps, right? Or if it has, it's been very inadequate. That has been the problem. I'm not really sure what we can do at this point. I've talked a lot about engagement. and I'm still very much an advocate of it. But in the current situation, it's getting harder and harder to find avenues to engage, but also find wedges between this axis.
Stay on this subject a little bit more. I picked up some comments referring to the China factor in all this, that it may be argued that this is not, let's say, the favorite trajectory from a Beijing position, that North Korea is once more able to play Moscow and Beijing as it has over many years. And we all know that recently we had this major conference in Switzerland on the Ukraine, and both Russia was not invited for obvious reasons, but even China abstained. And what I picked up is that there was considerable Russian diplomatic maneuvering to ask Beijing not even to send observers to the meeting, which they did. They didn't even have observers at the meeting, and they didn't participate in the meeting. And basically that effort from the Russians may have come with a price. And do you see that what we have now witnessed is something short of what the Russians really wanted to do in their engagement with North Korea? So China has had an impact on the outcome that so far is available for us to interpret. Heine, with your experience from China, do you have any comment and insight on this?
Well, in many respects, the Russians and the Chinese are strange bedfellows, and there's no love lost between them from a historical and candidly from a cultural perspective. That being said, they find that they have certain common interests, most notably opposition to a US-led global order. So I again imagine that Beijing is not particularly happy about some of Russia's actions and the fact that the Russians and the North Koreans are becoming closer and closer, because I think that the Chinese are viewing that as perhaps having a cost for their relationship with the DPRK, and perhaps in moments of crises diluting their influence with the North Koreans. Additionally, just as a caveat, I would note that it is interesting that Putin's trip to Asia is in essence bracketing China with visiting countries that have had, again, historically throughout the millennia, very tense relations with their big Chinese neighbor, notably Korea, of course, in this sense, North Korea, and Vietnam as well. So I think that, again, the Russians find themselves more and more as a junior partner, not just to the Chinese, but now also to North Korea in many respects, which must have, Putin's predecessors, both in Soviet times and maybe even Imperial Tsarist times, rolling in their graves, thinking that the Russians are dependent on political and economic support on the Chinese and on military support. I mean, think about this, on military support from North Korea, one of the poorest nations in the world. Yep. And in that context, I actually see some potential opportunity for the United States and like-minded partners to also create additional dilemmas for Russia in terms of heightening the voices in China. And I'm sure there are voices in China, although they may be muted, that are concerned about Chinese support to Russia in its campaign against Ukraine specifically, and dragging the Chinese down an abyss. And this, I think, this seam in the strategic relationship between Moscow and Beijing is something that needs to be exploited. Moreover, again, the Moscow-Pyongyang relationship, I think the Chinese are viewing that with some trepidation, candidly, because although I certainly am not one that has espoused, the Chinese ever having any type of veto authority over North Korean decisions. I think that, they're, in Beijing, there's concern that the closer the Russians get to the North Koreans, the less likely the North Koreans are going to listen to the Chinese if something happens, or, in terms of additional provocations. And I think it'll be interesting to see in the coming months, because I do anticipate a renewed North Korean provocation cycle, because as we all know, it's election time in the United States. And usually when it's election time, especially along, around 3-day, long weekends in Washington, is when the DPRK likes to rattle the sabers. Now, I think we're going to find ourselves entering a period where there will be renewed provocative actions by the DPRK as the United States gets closer to the presidential election in November.
Frank, any comments on this about the China factor in all this about Russia DPRK?
Yeah, I agree with Heino. I think, and we're talking about the comprehensive strategic partnership between Putin and Kim Jong-un. So the trajectory of Russia and North Korean relations may not have been a surprise, but I was a little bit surprised by how openly, unequivocally, the two countries are announcing how they're working together to fight against what they perceive as this neo-colonial US-led world order, right? And we have that sort of coalition starting to build. There's certainly the US-led effort with Japan and other like-minded countries to strengthen this lattice work or network of allies and partners to fortify this rule-based order. So that element of Cold War coalitions is developing, similar to reminiscent of the sort of the NATO Warsaw Pact era. But talking about China, I think there's reasons that China could potentially be resistant. Heino has talked about reasons why China could see value in strengthening Russia and North Korea ties. But China has also repeatedly opposed a Cold War mentality and the use of these types of coalitions, especially the US alliance system. I think China would also be wary of any blocs that would undermine its own economic relations with advanced economies that it has ties with. And then similarly, even a country like South Korea under Yoon Suk-yeol has been wary of entering into any coalitions, especially that include Japan, that appear to be ganging up on China. And I would also mention that Japan itself has robust economic relations with China, and these were some of the issues that were discussed in the China, South Korea, Japan trilateral summit. So, I think the formation of these coalitional axes is something that seems to be growing, and it could be problematic in the future, and something that we need to keep our eyes on.
Thank you. We'll put that on the table for some time, and I like to move over to another issue that you mentioned in your introductory remark, Frank, this about the new policy on unification that was articulated in the beginning of this year, that North Korea doesn't view unification policy as they traditionally has before. So how significant would you say this change of direction and change of policy from Pyongyang is? And do you see this as has been assessed by some Korea expert as a more or less a prelude to a more aggressive behavior, even war? Or do you see it as something that may, in the longer time frame, be something that could pave the way for kind of establishing normal neighborhood relations or something like that? Is that so? How do you see this new policy? Maybe if you can start, Frank, this time.
Sure. So, I already mentioned in my initial remarks that this is a shift in long-standing policy going back to the early 1970s in terms of how North Korea deals with South Korea and their support for peaceful unification. So in that sense, it is a transformational shift how it plays out and is operationalized, we'll see. But we've already seen North Korea take steps to institutionalize this policy shift, the dismantling of policy and organizational structures that talk about unification. So that tends to suggest that it's not just a temporary tactic, but something that's more long-term. I know there are some people who are concerned about a potential offensive rationale for North Korea's abandonment of unification, that somehow it provides North Korea with the justification to attack South Korea because now South Korea is no longer a related state, right? But I think it makes more sense to think of North Korea's rationale as defensive, because by emphasizing South Korea as a separate state, North Korea is trying to prevent any potential or right for South Korea to somehow absorb North Korea in the future, or for South Korea to intervene in any way in future talks with the United States. We're seeing right now that the Yoon administration is close to announcing a new national unification formula that will emphasize unification based on a liberal democracy. And North Korea views this approach as basically a regime change and absorption policy, right? So I think, South Korea is basically like one partner in a relationship saying that, the marriage needs to be based on a certain principle. And North Korea is saying, hey, we're divorced, right?
Yeah.
They're ending any discussion of this, right? So, it might be more practical and beneficial for security if South Korea starts to focus more on a normalization or separation policy, something that the UN already, recognizes the two Koreas as separate states, rather than a unification policy.
Thank you. Any comments on this, Aino? On the unification policy?
So I think Frank certainly knows much more about this topic than I. I would say what concerns me is that when you take this shift in policy, it's much more than just a rhetorical shift. And we've all grown accustomed, if not somewhat desensitized, to some of the rhetoric that comes out of the DPRK. But now you have a policy shift that could in fact have implications for not just inter-Korean relations, but again, how does that impact specifically the U.S. South Korean alliance? And again, as an American and somebody who was privileged to work on our defense relations, it would be interesting to know, and again, I don't know the answer to this, how much of this shift in North Korean policy is impacting the U.S. ROK alliance, because I think it is more than just a DPRK ROK issue. And as I stated, and I think it is more than just a rhetorical shift. So I do believe that this could have impact on how Washington and Seoul relate to issues of security on the peninsula.
Thank you. Talking about the alliance, I would like I can't resist the temptation of having two U.S. experts in front of me and ask questions relating to a little bit of let's say U.S. domestic issues, and we have already touched upon the upcoming election. So two questions. One directly linked to the election. What do you see as possible impacts on U.S. policy in relation to the Korean Peninsula? Would it be a Biden staying in power or return of Mr. Trump to the White House? That's one. And maybe a little bit associated to this one is something that is being discussed quite extensively in South Korea, and that's the extended deterrence, and what effort can United States do on top of what they already have done in order to kind of mitigate the discussion in South Korea about developing their own nuclear arsenal would be maybe another transformational shift on Peninsula security issues. So if we, two big questions, but hopefully some good answers. Thank you. Heino, please.
So, at the end of the day, the alliance is based on common security interests as well as common values. And I think fundamentally, neither those interests nor those values are going to change regardless of who the American people choose as their next president. So I think fundamentally, those things will remain, as they say in the alliance, ironclad. There may be, and I would anticipate there could be some changes in tone and tenure, depending on whether or not President Biden is reelected or President Trump is reelected. We saw in the Trump administration, and again, I was a proud member of that administration, that the relationship between Seoul and Washington was at times tense and tenuous. But I would tell you, in relationships between democracies, that happens. And candidly, it's not just elections in the United States that can impact that. It's elections in the partner country, in this case, South Korea. I think President Yoon has been an amazing partner for the United States, and that President Biden was fortunate to have such a partner who shared a common worldview. I would say that during the Trump years, President Trump did not have a partner like that in President Moon. And, on strategic issues related to the PRC, as well as to engagement strategies with North Korea, as well as on operational issues, alliance issues, such as the THAAD site in South Korea, and many, many other issues. The Moon administration certainly did not help matters. So that's one point. Extended deterrence, again, both President Trump and President Biden, there has been no change in U.S. policy. One thing that I have seen, obviously, during the Biden years, and again, I would say the Biden-Yoon years, because it's not a one-way street. Okay, it's very, there's agency on South Korea's part. There's agency on the government of South Korea's part. And again, I think it is worth highlighting that there, was considerable changes with President Yoon. The extended deterrence mechanisms and cooperation and underscoring America's commitment has in fact been enhanced in the Biden-Yoon era. And I certainly hope that that will continue, because I do not think it's in South Korea's interests to develop their own nuclear capability, because I think we'll find ourselves, down a very slippery slope, because I do not anticipate that if one country in East Asia, one democratic country in East Asia determines it needs its own sovereign nuclear capability, that others would not follow suit. And I don't think that's in the best interests of the region or of the world writ large. But I would also say that we do need to be realistic about American forces in the Korean Peninsula. We've maintained, 28,500 troops there for quite a period of time. But the world has in fact changed, and America's security requirements in the world are changing literally daily. And I think it would be naive to say that the forces that we have on the Korean Peninsula can only serve one specific mission, which is to deter the DPRK, and if needed, to prevail in conjunction with our ROC allies against DPRK aggression. I think we need to keep in mind that we all need to maintain strategic flexibility, and the fact that we have historical precedent, which is the temporary rotation of U.S. forces from the peninsula for combat operations in the Middle East. So I think, again, strictly from an operational perspective, We need to ensure that we have very, very robust conversations. The United States has very robust conversations with our South Korean allies to understand the requirements that the United States is facing globally, and frankly is having a very, very difficult time meeting. Again, back to my point earlier about the failure of deterrence.
Thank you, Frank. What do you make out of the upcoming election, and what's your take on that, and also this about the extended deterrence?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions packed in there, and I probably won't be able to address all of it. But I mean, first I'll say in terms of the elections, the U.S. public doesn't tend to prioritize foreign policy as one of its main deciding factors for who it votes for. It tends to be more domestic pocketbook type issues. But I do agree with Heino that the values of the U.S. people are largely consistent, right? But because the way they express these values aren't prioritized in terms of their voting behavior, the U.S. government can sometimes take that latitude to control the direction of foreign policy in whatever way it sees fit, right? And so I think, just really briefly on Trump-Biden, it's likely we'll see a greater, more unconventional willingness from a Trump administration to engage with North Korea. I think President Trump now feels comfortable in that issue set. He's met Kim Jong-un 3 times. He could probably tell any intelligence briefer, I don't need to listen to you. I met him. Have you met Kim Jong-un, right? So there's this familiarity that Trump has. He also probably wants to achieve certain foreign policy goals, and he feels like North Korea might be not a low-hanging fruit, but something that, he has some flexibility to move on. I think if there's a Biden administration, again, Biden has been working foreign policy issues. Him and his main advisors like Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, they've been working on these issues for decades. Their way of viewing North Korea is largely set, right? And so I don't see too many changes in a second Biden administration on how it approaches North Korea. I mean, it obviously would have to conduct additional policy reviews and make some adjustments because the current approach isn't providing any dividends, but I think we'll largely see the same course. I want to go to Heino's points, and this is where I actually diverge from his thinking when he says that the Moon administration was worse for the U.S. alliance. Again, he largely said that, the alliance, has consistent values, right? And I agree with that. And I also think that, both countries as co-equal partners of the alliance have their own policy preferences. They may agree on a lot, but they also diverge in many instances. But there's cases where, the Moon administration the Moon administration has said many times that, how much of an advocate and, believer it is in the alliance, right? And it showed that tangibly through the investments in U.S. industry, in electric vehicle batteries, these sorts of things, the purchases of U.S. security assets over the years, those things have continued in the Moon administration, right? That is a sign of a healthy alliance. There are areas of disagreement, right? Things like the end of war declaration that the Moon administration is pushing and the U.S. side was a little bit wary of, right? But, we can't say kapchida or let's go together only on issues where we find favorable, right? There are things that the South Korean side wants as a co-equal partner of the alliance that we need to give considerable thought to see why they want certain things, right? And then similarly, you have the Yoon administration that is doing a lot of great things with the alliance, but there are also areas of friction, right? Areas in which, we think the Yoon administration is acting too aggressively without restraint, and we need to try to pull them back. That is causing some disruption in the alliance. Also in terms of reassurance measures, right? We, of course, are on the same page about deterrence, but, South Korea is pushing for larger measures of reassurance and deterrence, things that sometimes make the U.S. uncomfortable, and we feel like we have to push back on as well. So any South Korean administration are going to have priorities that don't align with the US, and we'll have to push back when necessary, but also listen to things when we feel like it could be to the benefit of the alliance and our own national security interests.
Thank you very much, both of you. As I said in the early stages of our conversation, I think one area we need to get back to is to discuss possible way forward. And I think both of you have addressed the increased tension, the transformation that is taking place, the risk of increase in provocations. We have upcoming elections where the usually North Koreans is good at scripting these kind of provocations. So one of my concerns, is also from my experience working in the DMC, is that, and we have started to see small signs of this already, with the warning shots being fired about a week ago, and activities going on in the DMC, that we are in for a period of possible increase in provocations and risk of provocations going wrong, being misunderstood, miscalculated. So what do you think we need to do, maybe a little bit collectively, in order to reduce the risk of provocations and incidents? And is there anything that in your assessment South Korea, US, the international community, Europe can do in order to reduce these risks that I think we may agree is there in front of us? So, Heino, do you have any good recipes and advice?
I wish.
I wish, yeah.
I mean, I think we can all admit that we've tried so many different ways, whether it's, a pressure-based approach or an inducement-based approach with the DPRK. And although, as Frank highlighted, there have been periods where it's been relatively calm. I mean, relatively, I guess you could say, but the trajectory has always been the same, North Korea, which is provocation, aggression, duplicity, you name it. So I don't have any silver bullets, although I do believe that any strategy to mitigate against DPRK aggression has to be one that involves our partners and allies. So again, not just the United States, not just Korea, but Japan in particular, but others in the region, and more Europe. As we stated before, what the DPRK does has an impact on European security as well. So I think we need to see that, although on the one hand, the United Nations Security Council, again, as Frank said, quite clearly, is not going to be, I think we all agree, is not going to be an avenue for action, effective action against the DPRK. We need to ensure that, quote unquote, the West, democracies, and beyond just the West. So for instance, also, ASEAN, other groupings of nations that are not necessarily always universal in their outlook. North Korean aggression serves no benefit for anyone. And again, war, and I don't want to sound too hyperbolic here, but war on the Korean Peninsula would impact everyone, particularly in Asia, but beyond. So any types of mitigating strategies need to include the broadest base of international involvement. And I do believe, again, I think, you don't need to be Nostradamus to predict something's going to happen between now and November. I certainly hope the U.S. administration, in conjunction with its partners and allies, is growing, an international community effort to, again, try to dissuade North Korea by taking additional provocative acts, by telegraphing a potential cost and position beyond what's already been in existence, as well as, again, ensuring that if something does happen, that there's an immediate response. And again, that immediate response needs to clearly communicate that the West has red lines with respect to DPRK actions on the peninsula.
Frank, working for the Institute for Peace, do you have any recommendations on how to maintain peace of the peninsula?
Well, I agree with Heino that, we are looking at potential provocative behavior in the next several months. Unfortunately, U.S. does not have a good track record of deterring provocative behavior. So we can deter all-out aggression, and we've been very successful with that. But we haven't deterred, of course, 6 nuclear tests and over 100 ballistic missile tests and other delivery systems, right? And so we have to understand and be cognizant of what we can actually deter, right? And so could it be possible that there are a 7th nuclear test or additional ICBM tests? Absolutely. We haven't deterred in the past, and we likely won't deter in the future, right? There's another concern is hard to attribute activities, things like cyber attacks, the landmine incident in 2015, the sinking of the Cheonan in 2010. These were all things that we ultimately attributed to North Korea, but we couldn't do it immediately for various reasons. And because of that, our response measures were postponed, and maybe they lost some effect, right? That's a concern as well. There's also the possibility about things happening near the borders and at the northern limit line. Kim Jong-un has expressed his opposition to the formulation of the U.S. Or UNC depiction of the northern limit line and the border, and we could see North Korea taking action to challenge that border, right? So it'll be very hard to deter a provocation, and I think over the next few months, we could try again more conciliatory behaviors, but at this point, it's going to be very difficult because of where we're at in terms of the cycle of relations, right? It's going to take something unconventional, and it is possible. Remember in 2017 when we were talking about fire and fury, bloody nose strikes, President Trump at the UN General Assembly saying that he would totally destroy North Korea. Who would have expected that several months later that the 2 leaders are meeting at a summit, right? Yeah. So things are possible, but it requires an unconventional approach, not the status quo approach that we've seen. And I want to make one last point, because I didn't address this regarding extended deterrence and South Korea's desire for national nuclear capability. So, I've worked, when I worked in the Obama administration, it was a conservative South Korean president, to Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye, and there were efforts to get additional signals and measures of U.S. deterrence and reassurance capabilities. And the South Korean side would always justify it by saying, our people need more reassurance. They're asking for more reassurance. Interestingly enough, during the Moon administration, the South Korean people no longer needed that reassurance. They weren't asking for it. I don't think that's the case, right? The South Korean values and priorities are fairly consistent, right? In general, if you poll them, they support nuclear weapons. But when you tell them about potential sanctions, then that support goes down. I think it's really the administration in power that drives what they say, right? Remember, President Moon asked for an end to reassurance measures. He asked for an end to the deployment of U.S. strategic assets, a reduction of military exercise, right? I don't think the South Korea's desire for reassurance changed. It's just the administration's prioritization has changed as well, right? And so I think, at some point, the U.S. may run out of things that it can offer South Korea in terms of reassurance, right? We've offered as many consultative groups and visits to nuclear bases and enhancement exercises as possible. There's not much left in the goodie bag, except things like nuclear sharing and the redeployment of U.S. nuclear weapons to the peninsula. And so if we really want to forestall the development of ROC indigenous nuclear capabilities, We can try to push this out as long as possible and offer them any number of these sorts of things to delay. But ultimately, the best way to shift attention away from nuclear weapons in South Korea is to reduce North Korea's provocative behavior, right? If North Korea is not conducting nuclear tests, they're not conducting ballistic missile tests, not engaging in harsh rhetoric, then there's less media attention that's providing this, uproar for the U.S. and South Korean governments to respond with additional deterrence capabilities, right? We saw this in 2018 and 2019. And so I think if we can get North Korea to be less provocative by engaging with them and offering incentives, we probably also reduce the latent desire for ROC indigenous capabilities.
Even though the time is up, I have one last final, and maybe you can offer a quick comment on that. One of the differences now, if we compare to 3, 4, 5 years ago, is that we have had a long period of basically no physical interaction with North Koreans. They've had people at some of their European and other embassies, but they have not been replaced. So they are, let's say, out of touch on the realities in Pyongyang. All these institutions and think tanks that work with the relations with North Korea, travel to North Korea, have guest research programs, that has been on hold and pause for now 4 or 5 years. So we have a lack of fidelity of understanding North Korean, as I understand it. But now we've seen a small kind of retake of some of these diplomatic positions from the North Korean side, Vienna, Geneva. As I understand, the Brazilian ambassador has recently returned to Pyongyang. So is that an option to start looking for, let's say, the non-traditional partners? You talked about the value of partners, Heino, to countries like Mongolia, Brazil, others that we can use for this kind of need of a strategic communication narrative that do not get close and even close to these kind of red lines, and to show the North Koreans where the red lines are. Is that maybe a way forward? And I'll let you start, Frank, and then over to you, Heine. So Frank, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to exhaust all diplomatic channels and avenues for trying to engage with North Korea. But North Korea has a vote, and they're dictating how they interact with the international community. It started with favorable countries like Russia and China. We're seeing now, Brazil, you referred to, Nicaragua, other countries like Mongolia. And of course, the DPRK has had decent relations with various European countries. And so I think those European partners need to continue to push, and also even maybe have a little bit of hardball tactics, because it's not fair, according to the Vienna Convention, to have DPRK ambassadors in these European countries, and for them not to extend that same reciprocity for European ambassadors to return to Pyongyang, right? So we need to push, but again, I think the timetable is going to be set by North Korea.
Okay. I know, please.
Let me just, if I may, talk very, very briefly about America's commitment to South Korea. There's no greater example of assurance or reassurance than the permanent stationing of U.S. forces in South Korea, coupled with the fact that these forces are accompanied by their families. So I think that is the greatest reassurance that the United States can provide to South Korea. So I just wanted to make that statement. I certainly also advocate for channels of dialogue and diplomacy with North Korea based on, again, a principle of reciprocity, but also influenced by a sense of reality. The regime is what the regime is and has been for quite some time. I certainly cannot envision particular downsides to leveraging unofficial channels and diplomatic channels as well. But we need to ensure that they are guided by a sense of reality.
Okay, thank you both, Heino and Frank, for this strategic talk conversations. I'm really happy we managed to pull this off, and also having such a great support by external events that kind of put us in a frame of what we just have been discussing. So thank you very much. This will be up and recorded on our social media platforms for anyone that wants to access and share it. And for those interested, once more, we'll do a third iteration of this tomorrow morning, Swedish time at 9 o'clock with 2 South Korean experts. So thank you very much for those that listen, and thank you to Heino and Frank, and hope to see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.